Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Matheson, the co-lead of the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum, and also the Director of Strategy and Innovation for Clear Seas Centre for Responsible Marine Shipping. Before we get started today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'd like to express my gratitude for their stewardship of these lands and waters since time immemorial. To set the scene, for those who don't know, the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum is a community of practice that's hosted by MEOPAR, the Marine Environmental Observation Prediction and Response Network, and Clear Seas Centre for Responsible Marine Shipping. The community of practice is open to all who are interested in the work of understanding and mitigating shipping risk. So thank you so much for joining us for the first session in our 2023 webinar series. Today's session is focused on marine liability and compensation, or who pays for an oil spill in Canada and beyond. And we have today with us our speaker from the ShipSource Oil Pollution Fund, Ryan Gauvin, legal counsel. And just before I formally introduce Ryan, I'd like to ask everybody to stay muted during the presentation, and you're welcome to put questions as they occur to you into the chat, or save your questions for the end, and you're welcome to raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask your question. We don't really have time to do a full round of introductions, but if you would like to put your name and organization and a little bit about the work that you do into the chat, please feel free to do so, and you can introduce yourself to those who are assembled that way. So our original intention for today's session was to have two speakers. So I have some good news and I have some bad news. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Julianne St. Cyr from Transport Canada, is unable to join us today, but the good news is that makes for a shorter webinar and everybody gets a little bit of time back in their day. So hopefully we'll be able to catch Julianne at some other point in time to be able to hear what she has to say about marine liability and compensation. So it's too bad that she's not able to join us today, but we are pleased to have Ryan present to be able to go through everything that the ShipSource Oil Pollution Fund covers when it comes to marine liability and compensation. So to introduce Ryan, he has been in the role of legal counsel for the ShipSource Oil Pollution Fund for nearly 5 years. He has a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of British Columbia and a Juris Doctor degree from Dalhousie University. Today, Ryan's going to focus on the role of the fund as a source of direct compensation for Canadians affected by ShipSource oil pollution. He's going to give some practical tips describing the claims process and how to present a successful claim using some recent examples. And he's also going to explain how the administrator of the fund takes steps to ensure that responsible parties pay. So looking forward to hearing all that Ryan has to say on the topic of compensation. So Ryan, I will hand over to you now to go ahead and share your slides.
Sure. Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you to Clear Seas and the Canadian Marine Risk Forum for hosting this event today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. So I'll get the slides up on the screen and we'll get underway. Okay. All right. Hopefully the slides are visible to everybody. Wonderful. Okay, so as Megan said, I'm in the role of legal counsel at the ShipSource Oil Pollution Fund. We have a very small legal team, 2 lawyers, and usually we have an articling student on hand as well. And in addition to that, our staff consists of the whole area of corporate support, communications, some research and policy people, as well as a small team of in-house marine experts who help us with one of the core elements of our mandate. And we'll speak to that a little bit later. And I'll probably expand what the initial presentation was going to be today, just to give a little bit of background on the general regime in Canada for liability, first of all, for ShipSource oil pollution damages, and also compensation, which is sort of our half of the game. Although I say that, we also deal with liability, and all of that will become clear as we move along. So you're welcome to take down my contact information there. And as Megan says, the webinar itself will be recorded and posted. And I suppose a copy of the PDF slides can be circulated as well for any who are interested. So here we are. Now, the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund is it's a special purpose fund that was in an earlier form instituted decades ago. In its current form, it came into being in the late 80s, 1989. So we've been in place for over 30 years, operating much as we do now. And the core purpose of the fund is to ensure that Canadians who are affected by oil spills or incidents where an oil spill is threatened from a ship or a boat in Canadian waters are compensated within the bounds of the law. Now, as I've mentioned already, there's a liability scheme in place, and we generally refer to this as a polluter pays regime. And in this context, the polluter, or the responsible party, as people are saying increasingly, is the ship owner. And for certain classes of ship over certain sizes, you've got mandatory insurance in place, which means basically that any claimants, any people affected by an incident don't have to go directly to the ship owner, or they don't have to pursue the ship owner, him or her or itself, if it's a corporation. They can go directly to the insurer, and the insurer has to is obligated or liable in a sense to pay any quantifiable damages caused by an oil pollution incident. So back to us, let's see. We provide, since 2018, unlimited compensation to claimants per incident in Canadian waters. So up until 2018, there was a cap on the amount of compensation we could pay. It was about $180 million when that cap was removed. And so what does all that mean? Essentially, if there's a ship source oil pollution incident involving a very large vessel, let's say a tanker, and there are wide-ranging damages, response costs, there are property damages, you have various levels of government involved, engaged in response operations, and certainly you have individuals and businesses that are affected. You have Indigenous persons and bands that are affected, nations that are affected in all kinds of contexts: economic damages, fisheries damages, tourism. The whole whack is possible in this case. Well, if the worst should happen, and obviously there are many safeguards in place, and shipping has become much safer through the years. But in the event of a sort of worst case scenario type incident, there are many layers of protection, many layers of compensation available. And the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund is just one of those layers. You've got compensation coming from the ship owner and its insurer. You've got compensation coming from two international funds to which Canada makes contributions and is entitled to compensation in the event of a tanker incident. Those are the International Oil Pollution Compensation Funds, or the IOPC funds. And in Canadian dollars anyway, the IOPC funds and the coverage that's available from a ship owner and insurer exceeds $1 billion. So that's substantial funding in place already. Well, the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund then can be tapped up to its balance of $400 million and beyond, in which case it would dip into the national treasury. And probably a levy would be reinstated on oil shipments to replenish the fund in that instance. Of course, we've never seen anything like this in Canadian waters, and we're ready for it. It is, as I say, the worst case scenario. But what Canadians benefit from with the fund is they have all that compensation available. And instead of the complex process of perhaps chasing after the ship owner, the insurer, going to the international funds in London, which of course would be available here as well, Canadians can come directly to us, and that sort of simplifies the whole process. And to take it down a few notches, though, to your smaller vessels and incidents that might be caused by fishing vessels or smaller cargo vessels, The international funds would not be available because those are not tankers. The Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund is still available to Canadians in those contexts for direct access compensation. No requirement to go to court. You can come straight to us with your documentation and we will process it. And we will ask you questions along the way as needed. It's a non-adversarial process. It's not at all like going to court where there are two sides. You, the claimant, come to us. We process your claim. We talk to you. We issue a decision in the end. And we'll talk a little bit more about that process in more detail as we go on. So in our history, we have received 500 claims. We've paid nearly 500 claims. The reason for that discrepancy, very small discrepancy, is because it takes us a little bit of time to process claims. And in some limited circumstances, we are in a position where we have to deny a claim for various reasons. And we'll talk about that as well, though it is quite rare. Okay, so moving on. The largest ever direct payment we've made out of the fund following an incident was $4.5 million. This was to the Canadian Coast Guard following the sinking of a tug in icy conditions in the St. Lawrence River a number of years ago. This was an unusual incident. It was a small vessel that and the sinking of which resulted in quite a large claim. You can see that the response operation there was complex. I believe we received a second claim as well from perhaps one of the local harbors in this incident. So again, that illustrates that many affected parties as there may be following an incident, can come to us and seek compensation. So you may look at that figure, 4.5 million, and say, okay, well, it's a real amount of money, but it's not an enormous sum. And of course, that's correct. This goes to show that in our 30-year history, we've seen very, very few large-scale incidents in Canadian waters. And I should note as well, when there is an incident, compensation might still flow to claimants, even without our involvement. We're always there keeping an eye on things, but it's very possible that the claimant will opt to go directly to the ship owner or the ship owner's insurer. And particularly in the cases of more sophisticated corporate ship owners and well-insured private ship owners, owners of pleasure craft and fishing vessels, let's say, when the insurance is in place, the money usually flows out and people get compensated. So in practice, what we're usually doing is paying when it's more difficult to obtain that compensation from the ship owner or the insurer. Now, that's our biggest claim. Here's our smallest ever claim, $217. It's a tiny amount. I think this was for some sorbent materials that were deployed or placed by a marina or an individual following a very small spill on the West Coast a number of years ago. The reason why we show you this figure is to emphasize that, yeah, we do the big stuff. We're in place to do the big stuff. We're equipped to do the big stuff. We can also compensate very, very small claims. There's no minimum amount that you can seek in compensation from the fund. And I should pause there for a moment just to say, if anybody has any questions as I go, you're welcome to raise your hand and I can address them. We'll have a more formal question period after the fact. But Megan, if you can just confirm we're able to address questions on the fly, is that correct?
Absolutely.
Perfect.
I've put a note in the chat to encourage anybody, if they want to put their questions in chat, they can. Again, yes, Ryan's welcome people to raise their hand if something occurs to you as we go along, but you can also save your questions for the Q&A period at the end of the presentation.
Perfect. Yeah. I'm happy to turn this into more of an unstructured conversation type presentation if people are looking to ask questions as we move, because I realize sometimes this can be a complex topic, and I'm happy to clarify as I go. So there's our largest ever payout, our smallest ever payout, I should say as well. We've got a claim that we're looking at right now that's up and over $20 million from the Canadian Coast Guard. But that is still in the processing phase. So all of that said, as I say, we do the big stuff, we do the small stuff. Most of our claims are in the $50,000 range. And the vast majority of these come from the Canadian Coast Guard, which, as you may know, is mandated to respond in cases of ship source oil pollution. both when an incident happens that causes a risk that oil will be discharged in Canadian waters, or after an incident in which a discharge has occurred. So that's the majority of our work. It's down around $50,000 per claim. We see a few claims that head up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a few into the millions, usually 2 or 3 a year. But the vast majority are around that magic number of 50,000. And we find that's because most of our work happens on the West Coast. Most of these incidents involving small vessels, usually under 100 feet long, 20 to 30 meters, let's say, and primarily former fishing vessels that have fallen into derelict condition. So that's, as many of you will know, a major problem that we have in Canadian waters. And the fund, to some degree, is available to provide compensation in the context of those incidents, provided that there is an oil pollution dimension. Okay, and here we have our 2 independent administrators. I see one of them is joining us today, Marc Gauthier, and Anne Lagarde is our administrator. And together, our 2 administrators sit as a tribunal, and their primary role is to assess the claims that come into the fund, to determine whether the claims are eligible for compensation in the first place, and second, if so, how much compensation. And there's various criteria that they work with to make these determinations. They have, as I've said before, a small team that advises them in this process, but they are the ultimate decision makers. And once they make a decision, in all cases, they will issue written reasons, usually in the form of a letter that we address to the claimant. And that letter will inform the claimant whether an offer is being issued or whether the claim is being dismissed. As I say, dismissals are quite rare. Where an offer is issued, the claimant has 60 days to accept the offer or to appeal it. And we'll talk a little bit more about appeals as we go along. You'll notice independent, I've mentioned that a couple of times. Our administrators and the fund in general is not actually a part of the federal government of Canada. It's an entity or an organization of sorts that operates under federal legislation, but it's arm's length from the government for one reason in particular, I would say. Because, as I've said, the Canadian Coast Guard is our primary claimant, it's important to have that arm's length distance so that the assessment process of the claims that are submitted is independent and not at all influenced or motivated by one side or the other. Basically, we, the administrators, the fund in general, is in place to make sure that Canada's liability and compensation legislation is properly effected, properly put into effect. And that means that there are various criteria that need to be applied to these claims, and that is the job of our administrators. Okay, so on our website, we have a few resources that we have designed to assist claimants in presenting claims to the fund. Generally speaking, claimants will look to the General Claims Manual here, which explains the general process behind how claims are submitted to the fund, how compensation gets paid out, and how to put together a claim. We also have an expedited process for small claims. Primarily, this process here is designed for small-scale response operations. So historically, this process has been used almost entirely by the Canadian Coast Guard. And it allows them to be compensated upfront, essentially, well, not upfront, after a response. Compensation is paid to the Coast Guard more or less immediately within a year following that response, with minimal documentation required upfront. So that documentation comes in later after we've made the payment, and we do sort of an after the fact assessment, which may involve clawing back some of the dollars that we've paid out of the fund. So it's a bit of a complex process, but the benefit there is that compensation is able to flow quickly following an incident. Finally, we have our manual for special loss claims, and this is a sort of unique residual provision in the Marine Liability Act, our legislation, that allows certain classes of claimants, primarily in the fisheries sector and also Indigenous claimants, to recover damages that would not otherwise be compensable under Canada's scheme. So this primarily includes subsistence type fisheries losses looking forward in time. So losses that have not yet been suffered, but where it's clear that those losses will be suffered. Let's say there's a major spill and there's a lasting impact on the food supply or perhaps traditional resources of a particular Indigenous group. That group might be able to obtain compensation that is forward-looking under that regime. And I should say as well that our manuals are being revised currently and will be in the next year or so publishing updated versions of these. In addition to our manuals, we have a couple of documents that are quite useful and targeted at certain groups of potential claimants. So we have one that's targeted at fishers, aquaculturalists, and those involved in related activities. Here, we're primarily looking at economic losses, as you can imagine, and we'll talk about the character of those losses a little bit later on. Every year, we issue an annual report, and this is a requirement that the legislation imposes upon the administrators to report on their activities and to publish financial statements of the fund, basically to account for how the fund has been used in a given year. We used to publish in these annual reports, we used to publish incident summaries right in the report itself, all the incidents that we had either kept an eye on through the course of the fiscal year or incidents that had resulted in claims to the fund that we had processed or were in the process of paying. But that portfolio got so big through the years that we now actually publish that material online as an appendix or an addendum to the annual report. So the link there will send you to the annual report, and we have a whole collection of the past years, as well as that collection of incident summaries. And I see we've got something in the chat. I'll just have a quick look. Okay, so Paula, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, has asked, do you have any ideas about how many claims have been paid under those special losses classification in recent years? Zero. It's not a process that has been widely used, and there are many ways to explain that. I think in general, our position is that the standard regime or the general regime is fairly comprehensive. That's part of the explanation. The second part of the explanation is that arguably it would require quite a large scale incident for forward-looking damages to in the fisheries context to be suffered. And we don't see a lot of those in Canadian waters, as we've said. And I know that our friends at Transport Canada are in the process of reviewing those special losses provisions. And there's discussion of amendments to the Marine Liability Act. And I can't speak to the substance of that, but there are changes underway. So when I say there's revisions of the manuals coming, it's quite possible that the special claims manual will actually be swallowed up by the general claims manual. But again, that's all speculative. We don't know the exact nature of the changes to expect. So the final item here that I want to show everybody is our compensation handbook for municipal, local, and Indigenous governments. And there's some overlap here, obviously, with the fisheries and aquaculture material. But here we're dealing particularly with things that may affect local government and sort of organizations that not so much just in the fisheries context, but also more broadly. We have seen a few claims from local governments, and some of the most notable ones in recent years were out of Ontario on the lakes, which, as many of you attending will know, the Great Lakes are used as water supply sources for many, if not most, communities in Ontario. And when there's an oil spill near a water processing facility, obviously measures need to be taken to safeguard that water supply, whether that means booming off the water intakes, or in the most extreme circumstances, shutting down a water processing plant, trucking in water, and perhaps even replacing the filtration material in the plant with material that is able to filter out hydrocarbons. And we had one example of that in Prince Edward County in Ontario, maybe 3 years ago, where the county incurred costs approaching $500,000 to do fairly substantial work on its facility, which it had to shut down, and as well to bring in water from another source because of concerns that there might be contamination in the water supply. So I believe we paid about $350,000 to that municipality. So there's one past example there. We've also seen examples of, I believe it was the Haisla First Nation that responded alongside the Canadian Coast Guard a few years ago in Kitimat to the sinking of a fishing vessel. Now, the Coast Guard hired contractors to raise the vessel, but all the while, the First Nation was quite involved with monitoring the situation and with deploying sorbent material. So the First Nation was quite successful in that case in submitting a claim to the fund, albeit a very small claim. I think it was about a $12,000 or $15,000 claim for measures and the loss of some equipment that was soiled by spilled oil. All right. Now, a little bit more context on sort of what the eligibility requirements are here. I've talked about ships. I've probably mentioned boats. Most of us think of ships as large commercial vessels. Well, we also cover damages that are caused by ships and boats. So this goes right down to your smallest vessels. We've seen a few claims from the Coast Guard with respect to sailboats that have sunken, provided that sailboat carries a little bit of oil, and most do, as we know, they have inboard or outboard engines. Some measures may be justifiable following a sinking or a grounding or some kind of a marine casualty event. So as I say, we can pay compensation following an incident involving anything down to quite a small vessel. And that would include also barges. We know some barges in Canadian waters are quite large. Most of them are not self-propelled. That doesn't matter. They're still considered a ship under most Canadian legislation, and certainly under our mandate, we are able to pay compensation following an incident involving a barge. Whether that barge is being towed by a tug at the time, or perhaps it's at anchor or moored, or whatever the case may be.
Okay.
The only thing I'll caution, is that.
All right, so Diane.
If a vessel has been converted to some sort of a shore-based structure, if let's say a barge has been fixed to the shore in a sort of permanent way, such that it would be very difficult to detach it and float it away, to navigate it away, it may not be a ship for our purposes. And we've seen one fairly recent example of this. I believe it was somewhere in BC. There was a barge that had been fixed to the shore with pylons and a ramp that was very much a permanent structure. We looked at it because the Canadian Coast Guard had responded to a spill from that structure. And we made a determination that we were not dealing with a ship. We were dealing with something that had essentially been converted, been altered to the extent that it had become a shore facility. So that actually goes beyond our jurisdiction and ability to pay. So that was one example of us having to deny a claim. All right. So we talked about ships, we talked about boats, barges, the whole deal. We also compensate in the case of a mystery spill. Now, Transport Canada will talk about mystery spills as well in much of its literature, as does the Coast Guard. And what do we mean when we're talking about mystery spills? Basically, imagine you get up in the morning, you've got waterfront property, lucky you, and you look out, and there's an oil sheen in the water. And you have a look around, and there are no boats, there are no ships. You can't really tell where this came from. But let's say you live in a remote area, and there are no sort of shore-based facilities around that could have spilled oil, or there are no shore-based facilities around that could have spilled the particular type of oil that's in the water. Or there are oil facilities around on the shore, but it's quite clear that they did not spill oil in this instance. Or maybe you operate a small harbor or a marina, And you're looking around and there's oil in the water and there's about 40 fishing vessels all around and 40 pleasure crafts. And maybe there's a freighter anchored off in the distance. And really you have no idea where the oil spill came from, but you're pretty sure it came from a ship or a boat. In both of these cases, we can pay compensation for response costs and for any damages caused by the spilled oil. Basically, if you submit a claim directly to us, and this is an important situation to note, there is no responsible ship owner to chase. Of course, there is behind the scenes, but it's not possible to discover who that might be. So it's a good thing the fund is in place here, because you can come directly to us. We'll look at the documentation. If you have documentation that suggests the spill came from a ship, then definitely provide that to us. But it's not on you to prove that. We look at the documentation, and unless we have evidence that the spill came from the shore, that spill probably originated from the shore or some other non-ship entity, we are obligated to process the claim, and we will pay it within our mandate. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide here. And I've already mentioned as well that response measures and costs in the context of an incident where there is no oil spill are compensable from the fund. Again, they have to be reasonable costs and expenses. They have to be proportionate to the oil pollution threat, but they are compensable nonetheless. So here's where I think it's important to remind all of our attendees that the fund is not in place to provide advance funding. We don't provide preparedness funding to claimants. The Coast Guard has funding sources of its own. Obviously, it has all the equipment in place. Ship owners are meant to have contracts with response organizations that respond in the case of a spill. Harbors and marinas certainly are encouraged to have oil mitigation materials on hand. We can't cover those costs in advance. Rather, there has to be some kind of a marine casualty incident, whether that's a grounding or a sinking or a listing event where a vessel clearly is taking on water and at risk of sinking or capsizing. That kind of originating event is necessary for us. But if measures are taken to prevent a spill from happening once there has been an incident like that, we are able to pay compensation. And this is an event that happened back in 2010, where a northern cruise ship vessel, sort of an expedition cruise vessel, grounded on a reef up north that had in fact been charted. It's a complicated story, in fact, but obviously the waters up north are tricky to navigate, and something went wrong here. Oops. And the ship ended up on the rocks, and the Coast Guard got involved, and the ship owner ultimately had the ship refloated without any oil being spilled. But the crux of the story here is that the Coast Guard was compensated in the end. The fund was standing by ready to pay compensation if it needed to, but ultimately it was the insurer in this case that paid out. So, all right, here's a quick overview of the damages that we compensate. And we've got a note down there that I think I'll touch on first. It's important to remember that any costs and expenses submitted to the fund need to be reasonable. And I've already used this word proportionate. That's basically the crux of what reasonable means in this context. If you have a very small diesel spill, it's probably not reasonable to spend many thousands of dollars to clean it up. Obviously, any amount of oil is bad for the environment. We recognize that completely, but our regime is built on this concept of proportionality because it's not considered, well, the regime itself doesn't really consider it appropriate to spend an enormous amount of money to prevent a small scale degree of damage. So that's much of what we do when we see a claim. We're looking for documentation that explains sort of in real time, especially in the context of a response, what the responders knew and why they were doing what they were doing, and the decision-making process behind the measures that were taken. So if a vessel sinks in a remote area, and let's say there was nobody on board that vessel, so very little is known about the vessel, and the Canadian Coast Guard sends a crew to check the scene out, and finds that it was a sailboat and there was minimal oil on board. Probably from our perspective, downscaling the response from there is the reasonable step, or is a reasonable step. But that may not be the case. Maybe the Coast Guard shows up and they can't tell what kind of vessel has sunken because it's in deep water and none of it is exposed, but they notice substantial amounts of oil welling up. Well, maybe they start to escalate their response at that point. And we may well find that that was reasonable because reasonableness focuses on what was known at any given time. And we recognize absolutely that in the context of an oil spill, it's an evolving situation, things are changing, and facts are not necessarily all known immediately. So in general, when we see a claim from a responder, we're quite ready to pay a large amount for a response on day one. If the finding after day one is that the situation is not a particularly high risk one, then probably the compensation and the response is going to come down, ideally in lockstep thereafter. If the opposite is true, then absolutely a reasonable degree of response and a reasonable degree of compensation for that response is going to escalate with time as well. So looking at that, we've got preventive measures, and we've talked to some degree about this already. These are response measures. Again, not preparedness, but any kind of response operation undertaken after an incident that either causes a threat of oil pollution or oil pollution itself. Then we have cleanup costs, which are tied with this. Let's say there's oil in the water and you're putting down sorbent materials and trying to remove or skim as much of the oil as possible from the water. That would be included there, as well as measures to clean up a beach in the immediate aftermath of an oil spill, possibly cleaning up property as well, although you'll note that we have a separate icon here for property damage. Also, we cover costs to reinstate the environment. And I'll anticipate a question on this one as well. How often do we see claims for environmental reinstatement? We haven't historically seen many, or it's certainly in recent memory, we haven't seen any claims for these kinds of damages. What do we mean when we're talking about reinstatement of the environment? It's something more long-reaching than immediate cleanup on a beach or on a shoreline, or in the water following a spill. If there's an assessment done and that assessment finds, on a scientific level that there is lasting damage to the environment that can reasonably be repaired, perhaps a government actor, perhaps an Indigenous group may choose to take measures over the long term to implement that rehabilitation. We're able to pay compensation again to the extent that the costs are reasonable. And this is one of the rare instances where we're able to pay forward-looking compensation. So we'll talk about deadlines to submit claims shortly. But crucially here, let's say after a spill, there's 2 years in which you're able to submit a claim to the fund. But let's say you get that environmental assessment done 18 months following the incident, and it says reasonably it's going to take 5 years to implement the rehabilitation measures that we recommend. So long as the claimant undertakes and commits to taking those measures, and so long as those measures are reasonable, the fund can pay in this limited case for measures that have not yet been taken at the time the claim is made. And then if we drop down to the bottom row here, we've got, sorry, advance the slide by mistake. We've got economic loss and fisheries loss, tourism and loss of subsistence living. These are all related in that they all have an economic character to them. And I should note that we can pay compensation whether or not the claimant's property has been contaminated with oil. So historically, we've seen very few claims in this context. However, occasionally we see, a fishing harbor with all kinds of fishing boats and equipment, and somebody's boat spills. As a result, there's contaminated gear, there's a contaminated fishing vessel. In some cases, even on the East Coast, there's a crate full of lobsters or crabs in the water, and those that catch is contaminated and has to be discarded because of that contamination, we're able to pay compensation in all of these cases. We're also able to pay compensation where no property has been damaged at all, but rather there's a spill that has caused a fisheries closure or has somehow otherwise disrupted fisheries. The same may be true in the tourism industry. Let's say there's a bad spill in a particular area that then suffers a major downturn in business as a result. We can pay compensation in that context as well. It's interesting in the tourism context and in the fisheries context. An interesting dynamic comes in here, not necessarily in Canada because we haven't seen a lot of spills on this scale, but internationally we're very aware that following a major incident, there can be very lasting effects on various industries. Not necessarily for sound scientific reasons. Maybe the effects of the spill have dissipated, but the impression of the consumer or the traveler, let's say, is that this area is somehow tarnished, and fisheries products and perhaps tourism in that area will suffer as a result. We are able to pay compensation that takes into account that sort of tarnishing of the reputation of a particular location. And even in the most extreme cases, we would be able to compensate the costs of advertising campaigns that are designed to rehabilitate that damage. So much the same character as rehabilitating the environment, we recognize that businesses that suffer following a spill need to rehabilitate their reputations in order to get back sort of online. And finally, loss of subsistence living. Here we're talking mostly about, it's still an economic character because the compensation that would be paid is of course economic, and it would be designed to replace materials or fish or shellfish, even sort of shore-going animals that might be hunted for food or for their pelts, whatever the case may be. If a community or a family can demonstrate that they used to take some kind of a resource legally, of course, from the environment, and they can't do that anymore, we're able to pay replacement costs to the extent that those costs are reasonable, which is to say market rates. So that's another important thing to note. And also in the context of fisheries and subsistence living, if it's possible for the claimant to go further afield to fish or to hunt as they used to do, we have to take that into account. And in that case, we'd be able to pay the heightened cost, the heightened overhead cost of extra fuel, extra wages for a crew of a fishing boat, let's say, in order to reach those areas. All right, and in terms of demonstrating, a reasonable case for this kind of loss, let's say there's a fisheries closure and DFO announces it and says nobody can fish in this particular area. That essentially allows the claimant to make an easy case for us. The claimant can come to us and say, look, legally, I couldn't fish in this area at all. But sometimes certain communities or fisheries industries might be affected by a spill before there's a fisheries closure in place. And in those cases, if we have the claimant, provide documentation that shows, well, we looked at the situation, there was oil in the water, the threat wasn't particularly well known, but we opted for caution. We are quite likely going to see that as a reasonable approach. So the fisheries closure is not necessary here. It's helpful to the claimant, but it's not strictly necessary. Again, reasonableness is a wide spectrum. It takes into account many possible approaches to a problem. It doesn't have to be the right approach. It just has to be understandable, we'll say, and proportionate. Okay. So we will keep moving on. We talked about this process already to some degree, the claims process with the fund. I should note here that claimants are also able to go to court. Claimants can go to court against a ship owner, in which case the fund will become involved in that litigation. But the simple question here is, if you can come directly to a fund that will process your claim without that adversarial process, you don't need a lawyer, We will talk to you, we will talk through the claim, particularly with first-time claimants. We're very happy to take things slow and talk things through. Why would you go to court is the simple question here. The only real reason is because you get an extra year to file your claim. So for whatever reason, let's say if there's an incident, you're affected by oil pollution, and you don't know about us, or you don't have your documentation together in time, and 2 years pass, you're not able to come directly to the fund anymore, but you do still have an extra year to go to court. And you file a legal action, we become involved. The ship owner is, of course, responsible for defending its claim. If it wants to defend, it can just pay you. If for whatever reason it's unable to pay you, or if it has a defense to liability, and those defenses are quite limited. In fact, I don't think there's any examples of them ever being made out in Canadian law. And just a little digression here, ship owners are strictly liable for oil pollution damages. So what does that mean? In Canada, what it means is that you, the claimant, do not need to prove the ship owner was negligent. You don't have to find that, oh, well, the skipper of the boat was sleeping at the wheel, or, certain safety measures were not taken. No, by virtue of being the owner of a vessel that causes an oil pollution incident, you are liable under Canadian law. So that's why it's a good idea to have insurance in place. And that's why we mandate insurance for larger vessels. So with that quick digression, again, the limited defenses, as I say, very limited. Circumstances where there's been sabotage, where the damage has been caused by an act of war, again, quite rare in Canadian waters, as we can imagine. And finally, negligent maintenance of navigational aids, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically what that would mean is if some government authority that's responsible for maintaining, let's say, a navigational buoy or a lighthouse is negligent in its maintenance of that. So the lights are not changed when they burn out in a lighthouse is a quick example. Or perhaps a buoy is lost in a storm. It's very well known that this has happened, and the buoy is not replaced in time. As I say, these circumstances are very rare, but it's a possibility. Crucially, if the ship owner has these defenses available to it on a certain set of facts, the fund is able to pay where the ship owner will not have to pay. Okay, and I see we may have another. Yes, okay. For what vessel size does Canada mandate insurance? With oil tankers, crucially, basically all tankers are mandated to have direct action insurance. And with non-tanker vessels, 1,000 gross tons or larger. So quite large for non-tankers. I should note, though, that's oil pollution insurance, liability insurance for oil pollution damages. In the context of wreck removal, there's new legislation in place that says that vessels 300 gross tons and larger have to have coverage in place. So that encompasses a much larger range of vessels. The reality is, in Canadian waters, in our experience anyway, most operational commercial vessels have insurance, and that's really, really good news. Particularly with the last box on this slide down at the bottom right in mind. We find where there is insurance in place, even if the fund has to pay upfront for damages to a claimant, the fund is very, very likely to recoup those losses down the line. So looking at our process here, oil pollution damage occurs, and you'll see in that image there, we've got oil in the water. As you'll recall, we don't require that there be oil in the water. It is the most common instance in our claims that oil has been spilled. But again, particularly with government claimants who are mandated to respond to prevent an oil spill after an incident, we occasionally see claims where a vessel has been removed or pumped out of water ingress without actually spilling oil. So you suffer your damages, and then as quickly as possible after you've got all the costs incurred, you put together your documentation. So what should that include? All good claims include what we call a narrative or a description of the incident. And the purpose of the narrative is to sort of gather all your thoughts after the fact and tell a story of what happened. Here's what I knew here's when I knew it, here's why I did what I did, and here's what happened overall, and here's what my damages look like. And of course, when you've spent money, whether on materials or contractors, or perhaps you've suffered economic damages, of course, documentation is required as well to establish those losses. What is that documentation going to look like? Well, it could be a whole broad spectrum of things. Of course, if you've hired a contractor, well, the statement of work, if there is such a thing, in this case, it should be provided to us. The invoice should be provided to us. Proof of payment should be provided to us as well. In the context of fisheries losses, when we're dealing with claimants who might be a business, you know, a fishing boat and crew and so on, financial statements and catch logs from previous years will be crucial, because you'll have to show that there was a shortfall resulting from a particular incident. Everybody carries a cell phone these days with a pretty decent camera in it. Take photos. You know, this is true of all classes of claimant. So the fund, pictures are extremely helpful to us. Pictures are perhaps not worth 1,000 words, though. Captions are important. Pictures are worth a lot of words when there's a short caption included with them, explaining what's going on in the photo. Crucially, also time and date stamp if you can, or at least you know, give us your best recollection. Most of that data is stored in the original files in any case. So those are some examples of documentation that could be quite helpful to claimants. We've already talked about the fast track expedited small claims process. So we'll carry on to the assessment stage. And basically, we've talked about the criteria that we look at. We have to first be satisfied that a ship was the source of the damages, and that the fact that the ship was carrying oil was crucial in the whole story of the damages being suffered. If there's a vessel that has little to no oil on it that sinks, and perhaps causes a navigational risk to other vessels and needs to be removed, it's very unlikely that the fund can pay any compensation. But because the way the Canadian regime works, with the environment sort of first and foremost, if that vessel has a couple of fuel tanks on it with diesel, or perhaps even heavier fuel, that starts leaking, the ship might also be a navigational hazard, but we are likely to see any raising or removal costs related to that vessel as oil pollution first and foremost, which means that compensation from the fund will probably be available. As I say, even if there's also a navigational hazard component going on. Okay, so we've talked about a fair bit of the assessment process here. I should say also, we have particular expertise in dealing with response operations to vessels that are relatively small, this sort of, you know, sub 100-foot long, you call it 100 gross tons. That's where a lot of the incidents we see occur on that spectrum. We have particular expertise in-house that allows us to deal with those kinds of claims quite quickly. We've seen enough of them. We know what the response operations look like. We're pretty quick at processing those claims. When we see something we haven't seen before, it's occasionally necessary for the fund to hire an external expert who will advise. And we may have further questions for the claimant in that case as well. So the time to assess a claim can vary quite widely. With the most basic claims, we generally turn them around well under 3 months. With more complex claims, we're getting up around 6 months. And with the largest and most intricate or the most novel claims, we're looking at sometimes up to a year or perhaps beyond to process those claims before we issue a decision. So we have here offer and compensation, but I'd prefer to frame this as a decision gets issued. And this is because sometimes the decision, rarely, but sometimes the decision includes a dismissal of the claim for various reasons. Again, in recent years, we've seen a few claims come in late and we've had to dismiss them on that basis. So once we issue our decision, a claimant has 60 days to either accept it, in which case we pay the full amount offered plus interest, which I think currently runs at something like 6%. So that's sort of designed to lessen the impact of the waiting period on claimants. So we pay that as soon as possible once we have the acceptance of the offer. And in the case of the dismissal or an offer that a claimant feels is too low, there can be an appeal to the federal court, in which case, the claimant challenges our decision, and things do at that point have to go to the courts. But there's a remedy if a claimant feels that we haven't seen all their evidence properly, or we haven't been fair, or we haven't correctly applied the law to their claim. And in all cases, we issue reasons supporting the decision that we've made. And finally, we've talked about this polluter pays principle, but we haven't talked so much about the fact that the fund is very much involved in enforcing it. Arguably, Canada's most frequent enforcer of the polluter pays principle in the context of oil, particularly in recent years. We chase down the ship owner and we attempt to shake down the ship owner. To the extent that there is money available there, we're obligated under the Marine Liability Act to take all reasonable measures to recover. So we do almost all of our litigation work on the legal side in-house now, which really keeps costs down. So we are able to pursue right into the federal court claims that go down, to the sub $10,000 level, and we've seen some success on this front. I've mentioned that most of our claims are quite small. Many of our claims come from derelict vessels. Obviously, the owners of these vessels, if we can find them at all, are often fairly impecunious. They don't have a ton of money. But in all cases, we try to reach some sort of agreement whereby we see some kind of recovery. And as I say, we're seeing increasing success on this front. The numbers don't look great, if we're honest, and we'll come to that shortly, but we certainly do our best and we're well equipped. Okay. Now, the final thing I'll point to, and this is a relatively new feature of the fund, I did say we're not able to fund preparedness, and that remains true. There still has to be an incident in this case. But in the case of a major incident, the fund is able to provide advance funding in the course of a response operation to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which most likely means the Canadian Coast Guard, in the event of a significant incident. And here we're talking about something that is truly on a very, very large scale. You can imagine if the response costs are heading up around $50 million, then the broader damages will be even more substantial. And of course, we're able to compensate claimants for those. In this case, we're not a traditional source of funding. The Coast Guard would approach Transport Canada, and Transport Canada would essentially instruct the administrators to release the funding to the Canadian Coast Guard. But the Coast Guard would have to justify its expenditures after the fact, basically by way of a claim. So it would be out there, it would be well equipped to mount a response operation. There'd be plenty of funding in place, but it would then have to support its expenditures just like any claimant would following a smaller scale incident down the line. So there is a possibility that some funds would have to be paid back. But again, in the context of a large incident, that context of reasonableness sort of swells, right? There's an escalation element there. All right. I thought I would touch a little bit on the activities that we've seen recently on the west coast of Canada, largely because this is where we see the vast majority of our claims. I say the vast majority, and in some years we're up around 70%, but looking at the last 5 fiscal years, we're looking at more like 57% of the number of claims, and the dollar value is likely to be quite high on the west coast as well. So we compensated in those 81 cases, we've compensated claimants in 73 of those files. I've touched on this already, but the reason for this discrepancy is that some of these claims are still on our hands in the assessment context, and possibly 1 or 2 or 3 of them was denied by the fund. And talking about, to use a fancy legal word, subrogation, this is where after we've paid a claimant, we take the claimant's rights and we try to recover against the ship owner. In those 73 files, of those 73 files, we've recovered from the ship owner on only 9. So subrogation law is interesting. Most insurers will have a subrogation practice where they try, if there's somebody who caused the damages that they've compensated, to recover the funds that have been paid out of the insurance company. Well, in the subrogation business, 5% recovery is pretty good, and so we're seeing more than 10% recovery here, which is some kind of a cause for celebration. Although again, it doesn't look or sound great. I would be fairly confident to say that the 64 cases there where we have not recovered, either we were not able to find a vessel owner at all. In some cases, we're dealing with vessels that don't even have a known name or registration in Canada. And if we could find a ship owner, it's quite likely that that ship owner was completely destitute financially, and there were no reasonable measures that could be taken to recover. So many of our BC files remain open. As I say, most of those files are still open. We're still trying within reason. But as I've noted, the prospects for recovery on the ones where we haven't seen a recovery are very limited. And of those 9 recoveries, 4 involved insurers. So 5 were from individuals or corporations that either had no insurance or dealt with us directly. 4 involved insurers. 3 of those files stemmed from the same incident. Many of you will remember the Marathessa, which caused a spill of some fuel oil in English Bay in Vancouver back in 2015. So 3 claims came to the fund there, 1 from the Port of Vancouver, 1 from the Coast Guard, 1 from the City of Vancouver. We also had the BC government involved as well, but it was litigating. It was in court against the ship owner, which ultimately settled with it. And here we had a 4th one as well, a very small fishing vessel in or around Campbell River that caught fire. We got in touch with the insurer following us having paid compensation to the Coast Guard, and the insurer very promptly compensated us in full. So a good example of the regime working well. Okay, and to touch on this as well, we know the importance of preparing for transboundary and large-scale incidents on the compensation side. Again, we're not on the response side, but there's tremendous value in having the fund involved on this front. So what does that include? Well, I've talked already about that advanced funding that's available to the Canadian Coast Guard in the case of a major incident. But we're also involved in transboundary liability and compensation with our partners down to the south. This is the TLC program. So meetings and exercises on that front, which involve both Coast Guards and payers on both sides as well as some industry people as well. We're also looking at, well, we've got already in place a memorandum of understanding in place with the large international insurers. And many of you will know these as the International Group of Protection and Indemnity, or P&I clubs. Basically, these clubs cover the vast majority, we're talking up in the 90s percentage-wise, of international shipping. And they are generally quite efficient and very reasonable to deal with. When there's been an incident, we're very quickly on the phone with these people and their representatives locally in Canada. And generally speaking, things are very, very quick to move. And that's sort of, it's not a promise to pay per se, but it's a promise to show up. It's a promise to show up and talk about paying. It's what we call in the legal world a turning to jurisdiction. So essentially acknowledging that the Canadian federal court has jurisdiction over a spill, and a promise that they will show up, or in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, before they even need to show up in court, there's a settlement that gets reached. And that may be with the fund, it may be with various claimants. But again, as we've said, we encourage claimants to come directly to us. We'll deal with the complex legal stuff on the back end, all the while in the context of an incident involving a larger vessel, knowing that we're protected because we have this agreement in place with the international insurers. And finally, I've mentioned already the international oil pollution funds, to which our fund, the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund in Canada, makes annual contributions to that pot of money. We work quite closely with the IOPC funds. We have very seldom actually had to work with them in practice following an incident, and that's because we've seldom, if ever, seen a major tanker incident in Canadian waters. But we're very much ready to work closely with these funds in the context of a major incident, drawing on their expertise as well, which stretch all over the globe. Whenever there's an incident of any kind caused by a tanker, the IOPC funds could potentially be involved. When it's a large-scale incident, they are involved, and they are receiving claims from claimants. And by way of analogy, I've mentioned before, the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund in Canada is always accessible first to Canadian claimants. Claimants can come to us directly, and then we sort out who actually ultimately pays on the back end. So there are many cases where, many hypothetical cases anyway, where the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund would not have to pay anything at the end of the day following a smaller scale tanker incident, but we are able to pay upfront to claimants. We're here, we're in Canada, we're trying to make ourselves as familiar as possible to people in this country who may be affected in the case of an incident. So as I say, we deal with the claimant, we can deal with the claimant up front, and then we can sort things out with the money moving around on the back end with the international funds and the ship owner. All right. Couple of recent court cases that I'll touch on. I've mentioned the possibility that claimants can appeal to the federal court after we issue a decision. Historically, these appeals have been very rare. I think in part because we have a capable legal team that gives good advice, but perhaps even more so because we have two administrators who really know what they're doing and who really know the regime and who make very reasoned decisions based on the facts and based on the law. So provided all of those things are coming together, the likelihood that we'll see appeals is quite small. That said, there are portions of the law, particularly in our context, I'll admit, because our regime hasn't been tested in court very much, perhaps because we haven't seen a lot of major incidents, where there can be some ambiguity. And perhaps the administrators issue a decision that causes the claimant to say, oh, I don't know about that. So first example of one of those, an interesting question that we had never been faced with before 2018. What if a ship owner, an owner of a vessel that causes an oil pollution incident, let's say that owner thinks it has a defense. It says, we're not liable. We didn't cause this incident. Not only did we not cause this incident, but even under that strict liability regime, we wouldn't be liable. And let's say that ship owner spends a large number of dollars cleaning up the oil spill or preventing an oil spill from happening, which is certainly what happened in this case. The ship owner takes the position that it has a defense to liability. It says that the vessel was sabotaged, and we never made a finding on that. So we can't really speak to this question of sabotage here. But it's indisputable that the ship owner in this case spent a good deal of money, nearly $2 million, responding. So pumping the oil off of this barge, refloating it, and towing it down to Vancouver where it could be repaired. We looked at this situation because the ship owner approached us with its $2 million or so in expenses, and we said, okay, this is interesting. We've never seen this before. We looked at the international oil pollution funds, where a tanker owner has a defense to liability, are able to pay out compensation. And we said, okay, well, if the international funds can do it, maybe we can do it. And we looked in a lot of detail at our legislation, and we made the determination that there was no way for our fund in Canada to pay in this context, in large part because there's no way for our fund to assess whether or not that defense is legitimate or not. We didn't have any real means to do that under the statutory regime. We're not allowed, in other words, we don't have the jurisdiction to look at defenses. So we made the finding that there was no way for the fund to pay compensation to the ship owner in this case, which is to say, sorry guys, hopefully you had good insurance in place. We issued our decision, and the ship owner appealed to the federal court. The federal court agreed with us in basically every way. And so the ship owner has then appealed to the Federal Court of Appeal, and that hearing is pending. I imagine it'll be in the next 6 months or so. So we're hoping for some final clarity on this point. And I should be clear, we're not, we don't look at this. We're very much approaching these things in a balanced way. When we first were faced with this claim, our first reaction was, okay, well, we are in place to pay compensation to parties that merit compensation under the regime. How can we do that in this case? And we looked at it, and ultimately the administrators found, no, our hands are tied. We're not able to pay compensation here. And so that was the decision that was rendered. So we don't see this as a win against the polluter in any way. Rather, we see this as a clarification of how the regime works. So that's one example of appeals. And the next example is, we talked a little bit about limitation periods or deadlines to submit claims. And I've been hammering home that 2-year timeline, or a 3-year timeline if you're going to court against a ship owner. If there's no spill, you get a little bit of extra time. If there's no spill, claimants have 5 years to submit a claim to the fund directly. But that's tricky and a bit of a pitfall for claimants, because when a vessel sinks, for instance, it's possible that you will not see an oil sheen around it. Particularly if nobody notices the sinking for a couple of days, maybe that oil has dispersed. Basically, when there's a sinking, we are very likely to make a finding that there was an oil spill and the 2-year timeline applied. Well, here, in neither of these cases was there a sinking of a vessel. In the first case, out in Newfoundland, the Stelly 2, sort of a medium to large size fishing vessel. The vessel was sort of tossed around in a pretty ugly storm. As you can imagine, there's quite a bit of ice floating around in the water there. It was holed, it took on quite a bit of water, listed quite heavily, and it was pumped out. And prior to the pumping out of the vessel, the Coast Guard noted that there were hydrocarbons all throughout the interior of the vessel. And that was the water that was pumped out in an emergency, mind you, into the harbor. No oil sheen was observed, says the Coast Guard, but we ultimately made a finding that there was effectively no way that this oil was pumped out of the vessel this water was pumped out of the vessel, oily water was pumped out of the vessel without some oil entering the water. And so we ultimately found there was a time bar here in place. And there was also oil in open containers on the deck of the vessel that we figured probably spilled as well. And in the other instance, vaguely similar, we had a smaller fishing vessel in BC that was a real mess, oil throughout the bilge space. And the bilge pump basically got to the point where the water ingress was so bad, the bilge pump couldn't keep up. And so additional pumps were installed into the bilge area. And again, we made a finding that while pumping oily water out into the harbor, again, to keep the vessel afloat for a legitimate purpose, probably resulted in some oil entering the water. And so that 2-year bar was applied. At the core of our finding there was basically, we don't need to see an oil spill. We don't need direct evidence that somebody has observed, excuse me, an oil spill. Rather, if the bulk of the evidence shows that a spill probably happened, we are going to make that finding. So the end result here, and the federal court agreed with us, is a caution to claimants. If it's not clear, or if it looks like a spill might have happened, you should assume that that 2-year limitation period applies. All right. So we will open it up to questions with that. Hopefully, I realize I've gone on for quite a long time. So hopefully we've got some good questions. I'm happy to take those.
Yeah,
and Megan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for being so thorough. You've given us a lot of information today. Appreciate that. So I've got a couple of questions in the chat, and people, please feel free to put more in the chat or raise your hands as questions occur to you. But I'll start us off with one that I think will be pretty quick for you to answer. Maureen Bolachuk has asked, is compensation limited only to oil? Are any other substances covered by the SOPF?
So only oil is covered. The good news is that the definition of oil in the Marine Liability Act and the legislation that we're subject to is quite broad. So we're looking at everything from the ugliest, thickest crude to heavy fuel, marine diesel, gasoline, aviation fuel, and essentially any product that is derived from petroleum, with the possible exception of plastics and well, certainly with the exception of plastics and styrofoams. And so long as it still has that sort of hydrocarbon character to it, it'll be covered by us. And of course, that includes water that is contaminated with oil. And I'll say, I won't say very much on the point, but we do have a hazardous and noxious substances regime internationally that's in the process of coming into force and will be in force in Canada in the next few years. But that's more for TC to speak to than us at the fund.
And I will just follow up on that to note that it actually does have to be a hydrocarbon-based oil, petroleum-based oil, because we have seen spills of other kinds of oils, such as canola oil, and that is not considered an oil under this definition. Am I right? Right.
That's correct. Yeah, we've seen a few cases internationally, and my understanding is on the West Coast not too long ago there was a vegetable or canola spill. So certainly a response would need to be mounted in that case. I'm not a scientist, but I realize that that's no good for the environment. Unfortunately, our fund would not be able to compensate for those response measures. That said, if a vessel carrying canola or vegetable oil as cargo sinks and measures are taken to clean up the fuel, and those measures happen to capture a little bit of canola oil as well, certainly some compensation will be available from our fund.
Thanks for clarifying. So just a very broad question or basic question, how much money is in the fund currently? And how do you know that that would be enough in the event of a catastrophic spill, the worst case tanker spill kind of scenario?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I don't keep track of the exact balance on a day-to-day basis. We grow based on interest, but I want to say it's between 410 and 415 million as of today. The reason I don't keep track, and the reason why is that enough, is that not enough question doesn't really keep us up at night anymore, is the compensation we can pay isn't limited to the balance of the fund as it currently stands. If there is a major incident, there'll be compensation available from the insurer of the vessel, assuming it's a tanker, the international oil pollution funds, up to over $1 billion. Then the fund steps in. And if the fund is depleted, we can dip into the national treasury, which starts to sound like taxpayer dollars, certainly, but most likely we would reinstate a levy on oil shipments in and out of Canada to ultimately pay back any amounts that we had to draw on the treasury for.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. I wanted to move on to the idea of mystery spills a little bit more. So you've mentioned that mystery spills are eligible for compensation. But I know of a situation where pollution from a commercial ship was not eligible for compensation, even though it started as a mystery spill, but they figured out where the spill was coming from. But there was no way to submit a claim within 2 years of the incident because it was a historical wreck. Can you talk a little bit about why this 2-year limitation was established and if there's any possibility of it being extended in the future?
So I can't necessarily speak to any potential for changing the way that the law stands, because it is very much in the statute, and that's the mandate of Transport Canada. But I can speculate as to why, and it's a sort of a common concept let me backpedal a little bit. The law is an uncertain thing. And legislators and courts do their best to bring as much certainty into the law as is possible. And when you look at the marine world, you've got these vessels that need to be insured for various reasons. In many cases, they're required to be insured. And the insurers, from a market perspective, from a business perspective, need to be able to assess their risk, which is to say, any parameters that the law can introduce that allows the insurer to calculate what its risk is will be helpful. And again, premiums have to be kept within some degree of affordability for businesses. So it's important, I think, for the regime to bring in some limit to foster that certainty, or some degree of certainty on the part of the insurer. So I recognize that there are historical wrecks in Canadian waters that occasionally leak oil. There are no doubt wrecks that are very, very much unknown that have yet to leak substantial amounts of oil and will one day. Our fund, unfortunately, is not able to pay in those cases because the underlying incident happened more than 2 years ago or 3 years ago in terms of a court action. And as I say, hopefully that sheds some light on why we have those limitation periods. It is important to look at the issue from both sides and recognize that from the perspective of business, it is nice to have a horizon on liability.
And what if there was a mystery spill where the source wasn't immediately determined, but it was later thought to be likely a historical wreck from before the SOPF was created? Would that be eligible for compensation for the cleanup that was done before it was known where the source was?
It's another very good question because the recurring theme, one of the recurring themes anyway in today's presentation has been, well, this concept of reasonableness and what the claimant knows when the claimant knows it sort of rules over all other things, and that speaks to the kind of precautionary nature of the way our regime is built. We want people to respond. We want people to take measures. We want people to clean up. We want people to remove vessels that are spilling oil. So we focus generally when we're making an assessment on what the claimant knew when, and noting that, as the situation is evolving, the facts aren't always completely clear. However, in the context of a mystery spill, or perhaps I shouldn't even call it a mystery spill, let's say it's from a shore source, ultimately determined to come from a shore source, and the Coast Guard responds not knowing what the source is immediately, thinking it probably came from a ship, and then later evidence emerges that it did not in fact come from a ship. We can't pay compensation at all in that context. And the same would apply for a spill that was ultimately determined to come from an historical wreck. If there's oil in the water, it's not known where it came from, measures are taken to respond to it, and then later it's determined it came from an historical wreck, we would not be able to pay compensation.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thinking about other ways that compensation can occur, I believe there was a change in legislation that allows for compensation taken in action, or for action taken in response to the risk of a spill. So if there's a spill that is likely to occur and say the Coast Guard wants to set up a boom or do some other action to respond to that risk before it's an actual spill, have you seen an increase in the number of claims to the fund because of that change?
So again, it's an interesting point. I should clarify, though, that the regime, at least the regime that's been in place since the late 1980s, has always provided for measures to be taken following an incident, but in advance of an oil spill, in anticipation of an oil spill. And those measures were always subject to the same criteria, which is reasonableness. So looking at the threat, let's say there's a vessel that's that's run aground, and the tide is going out, and everybody involved can say certainly that thing is going to roll over when it's no longer partially buoyant, right? And leak oil. Historically, the fund always would have been available to compensate claimants in that context. The change that was made in 2018 to the legislation is quite a bit more nuanced than that. And in all honesty, we haven't really seen, in my experience anyway, we haven't really seen an uptick in the number of claims where there has not yet been an oil spill. But to summarize the changes to the legislation, they were essentially put in place to allow the Coast Guard a slightly broader mandate to respond. The language in the Act, and it is ambiguous language, I'll admit, is grave and imminent threat of oil pollution. So the concept previously was the Coast Guard was, if it wanted to recover its spending on a response operation, it had to establish that there was a grave and imminent threat of oil pollution damage happening. And generally our interpretation of that is just a spill is likely, and it's likely to happen soon. That's sort of the interpretation we brought. The legislation has since been expanded slightly to allow the Coast Guard to respond and recover from the fund, only from the fund, not from ship owners, where the threat of oil pollution damage is slightly lower than grave and imminent. Now, we don't know exactly where that is. We haven't established it yet. It hasn't been through the courts. But we do look at claims now, knowing that the Coast Guard has this broader mandate that comes from the Canada Shipping Act, and that's this change from the language of likely to discharge oil to may discharge oil, so a slightly broader response mandate, and the changes made to the liability scheme that allow for the Coast Guard to recover from us when there's a lower threat. But quite interestingly, around the same time, the Government of Canada brought in the Wrecked, Abandoned or Hazardous Vessels Act, which is WAVA, people are referring to it as, or WAVA. And that whole regime there is designed to deal with wrecked vessels, abandoned vessels that perhaps pose a navigational hazard. So the balance to be struck there is quite interesting, right? Most of those vessels that fall under the WAVA legislation are not going to be considered high oil pollution threats because oil pollution will take precedence. So trying to figure out sort of where a vessel belongs. Does it belong under that wrecked vessel scheme, or does it belong under our scheme? And perhaps there's a gray area between the two where the 2018 changes to the MLA that you're referring to, this grave and imminent language, allows the Coast Guard to get a few more claims in our door. But because it usually takes 2 years, or where there is no spill, as we'll know, up to 5 years for us to see a claim, I might be able to dodge the question entirely by saying we just don't know yet. We haven't seen enough claims following those changes to really make a sound assessment on it.
Fair. Still evolving.
That's right.
I wanted to follow up. You raised the question of a barge. And so you mentioned that barges are eligible for compensation unless they're no longer a ship because they're fixed to the shore. And so they're not defined as a ship anymore. So what about a situation where there was a vessel that was being used for fuel storage or maybe as a bunkering facility, and it's been anchored to the shore in such a way that it's no longer classified as a ship? If this non-ship ship spilled oil, would it be eligible for cleanup compensation, or like a barge, would it not be eligible because it's considered now to be a shore structure?
Yeah, we'd have to look at all the circumstances. So it's not so easy to present sort of a well, certainly we could provide a list of factors that might be able to help claimants navigate. Okay, to what extent are we likely to get a finding that this thing is a ship? The one example that I gave, and I'll be honest, it was a very unusual example. It was a barge that I think had used in the logging context or some kind of construction context, but it was so firmly fixed to the shore that we determined it couldn't navigate anymore, and that's the kind of core feature that a structure or a vessel needs to have in order to be considered a ship. So in that context, though, oddly enough, this structure was still registered as a ship in Canada, which threw a further complication into the mix for us. I mean, I think it's safe to say if it's registered as a ship, that helps the case that it's a ship, but it's not determinative. It's not a guarantee. So yeah, to answer your question concisely, if we determine that the barge has been modified to an extent that it no longer can navigate in the water without serious alterations being made to it, then unfortunately we would make a finding that it's not a ship, and compensation from the fund specifically would not be available. Most likely a claimant would have to go through perhaps provincial environmental legislation, or perhaps some other federal legislation or federal law to get compensation from the owner or its insurer.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience, and we're getting close to the end of our time this morning. You did very well, Ryan, to make up for Julie not being able to be here, Julianne. So I want to wrap up with the last question, thinking more broadly as we get to the edges of Canadian waters and start to edge into transboundary areas. So you mentioned the transboundary liability and compensation meetings and exercises. What does that look like? What issues is the TLC currently dealing with or thinking about?
So I should say I haven't been directly involved in those processes, but I've been hearing here and there and getting updates on them. There's a degree of complexity between Canada and the United States here, because we have two quite different regimes, and I should note both regimes are designed as best as is possible under the two separate national legal regimes, and in the context of the states, under the state regimes as well, to ensure that people who are affected by an oil spill get compensation. So those TLC exercises include the whole spectrum, from how do we mount a response that involves two coast guards? How do we mount a response that is complex and evolving? Involves at least two fisheries angles. So there's a ton of discussion and practical work done on the technical side. And then, generally speaking, things arrive at a table discussion of, well, how does compensation flow here? Where should people who are affected by this incident turn? What kind of mechanisms will we put in place to facilitate the rapid processing of claims if it's a large-scale incident, which might mean actually setting up sort of a claims assessment station near the site of the spill to allow people to access the funds directly, and then to speak to people who will actually be looking at these claims and sorting them and determining what recommendations to make to, from the fund's perspective, our administrators and in the IOPC and the various decision makers on the insurance side. So it's a very, very wide-ranging discussion on both technical response matters and on the compensation side.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you very much, Ryan, for sharing your knowledge and all of the interesting case examples with us today. And thank you to everyone who's taken part and participated in the webinar today. We're currently working on identifying some speakers for the next webinar in the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum webinar series. And if you or you know of anybody who'd like to present your work, please do get in touch. We're always happy to share the work done by the members of our community of practice and others further afield. So thanks all, and have a great rest of your day.